Hi everyone, we're going to continue with our USA revision in this video, and we're going to focus on part 2 of the specification about the experience of Americans after the Wall Street crash, their experiences of the Depression and their experiences of the New Deal and Roosevelt's attempts to try to fix the issues connected with the Depression. So we're going to think first of all about the 1932 presidential election and why Hoover loses this election to Roosevelt. So the Depression had certainly made Hoover incredibly unpopular. He had been elected before the crash to continue the policies of his predecessors, those previous Republican presidents who'd followed policies like laissez-faire, making America very, very prosperous. But when the Depression hits, Hoover is criticised as a do-nothing president. People don't think he's doing anywhere near enough to try and help the American people. For this reason, you have the homeless encampments called things like Hoovervilles because people blame him for them. People think that it's his responsibility. So he's become very, very unpopular. To a certain extent, this is a little unfair. He certainly doesn't do nothing, as people say at the time. He had tried to do some things. He brought in a new tariff in 1930, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which had been the highest in American history up to that point, to try to further protect American goods and encourage people to buy from American companies. He'd approved things like the Emergency Relief Act, given $300 million to states to support the unemployed. But despite this tag of the do-nothing president stuck, and this idea that he certainly wasn't doing enough to help American people out of the Depression. Hoover's reputation was further worsened in June 1932 when a group of war veterans protested that they wanted payment of their war bonus early. These were a group of men who'd fought in the First World War, and they were due to be paid a bonus in the 1940s. They demanded the payment of this bonus now to try and help them with the Depression. But Hoover becomes convinced that these people are secretly communists, that they're trying to destabilize the country. They set up camp by the White House, and Hoover authorizes the army to deal with them. Tear gas is used, and 2 babies even die from the effects of the gas, further worsening his reputation. And on the other side, Roosevelt was an increasingly popular candidate. He had previously been governor of New York, where he'd put into place various schemes to try and help people who were affected by the effects of the Depression. So Roosevelt, in contrast, was an increasingly popular candidate and one who people believed would actually do something about the problems of the Depression, and hence he's elected in 1932 as president. Roosevelt was elected on this platform. He said, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. And the New Deal is centered around these 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, to help the poor people, those who've been worst affected by the effects of the Depression. Recovery, to try and help the American economy to recover. And also some ideas about longer term reform, including measures that he could put in place to make sure things like this don't happen again in the future. So, what Roosevelt was trying to achieve was ultimately trying to get this cycle of prosperity going again that we talked about in our first video on the USA. We said that during the boom time, America had been selling lots of goods, so it increased production levels. This had given people good wages and work that was available. These people then have money to spend, driving sales up. He's trying to return to this, and he's going to try and do things to try and boost the amounts of people in work so that those people can try to buy again. So Roosevelt was elected in November 1932 and took office in March 1933. And during the 100 days, the first 100 days of his presidency, he sent 15 proposals to Congress, which become known as the New Deal. One thing that really distinguished Roosevelt from his predecessors was the way he also really took the time to explain what he was doing to the American people. This is known as Roosevelt's fireside chats, and you can see an image of him there broadcasting to the nation, explaining the measures he's taking and why he's doing them. And this again made him very popular and gave people confidence that their issues were being dealt with. The first issue that Roosevelt tries to deal with is the banking crisis. Now, you might remember from your studies of the Depression that during this time after the Wall Street crash, banks had frequently gone under, taking people's savings with them. People generally became quite panicked. So they would go and queue up at the bank, take their money out, but the banks don't have everyone's money there. They've lent it out for other things. And this would send banks bankrupt. They wouldn't have all the money there. Roosevelt is now going to try and take measures to restore people's faith in the banking system, to calm people down and make them confident that their money is not going to be lost if they leave it in American banks. So as I've just said, many banks had closed and investors were withdrawing their money from those which remained open. But the day after his inauguration, that's the day when he officially becomes president, Roosevelt closed all the banks for 4 days. This allowed new laws to be passed and for government officials to check the finances of the banks. He passes the Emergency Banking Relief Act, giving the government strict control over the banks. And after his auditors had been in, he now only allowed 5,000 trustworthy banks to reopen. What Roosevelt is really trying to do here is restore confidence. He doesn't want any bank collapses while he is president. He wants to emphasize to people this is a new start, that you can trust the banking system, hence not letting any banks that he's got concerns over about their future viability to reopen. Only those ones he knows are totally solid are allowed to reopen. The government also did this very clever thing. They guaranteed that all money put into the banks up to the value of $2,500 will be safe because it will be covered by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This was a very good move on their part because now, even if people remained a bit nervous about should I take my money out of the bank or not, what if it collapses, this removed people's need to do that. It made people confident they could leave their money in the bank because if they did, even if your bank did collapse, which it shouldn't do because Roosevelt's men have been in to check that, but even if your bank does collapse now, then your money's covered by the government anyhow. So this made people confident they could leave their money in the banks. He also brought in new rules to regulate the stock market as well. Now, the bulk of the New Deal, of course, concerns these alphabet agencies that I'm no doubt that you remember and are trying to recall all of them. So you can see the various kind of acronyms that are up there and some of the other acts that make up part of this. And we're going to talk about these various agencies. Now, with the New Deal, it's not enough just to know that there were alphabet agencies and that these existed. There have been previous papers where they've asked about specific ones of these agencies. They could give you sources where you're asked to talk about particular ones. So you really do need to, as best as you possibly can, try to learn all of these. The way in which I always do it is I try to have something that I try to associate with each one. And I find when I remember one thing about each agency, then the rest of it tends to come to me. So let's start with the AAA. The AAA stands for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And you might be able to see from the A, agricultural, you might be able to remember that this is to do with farming. Roosevelt wanted to end overproduction. You might remember that this is the thing that had made farming very, very difficult in the 1920s. And he did this by paying people to cut production levels. So it paid them to cut their production of main items such as cotton so that prices would go up. This was a very clever scheme because not only would it provide some initial relief to farmers in the payments that were made, it should hopefully also solve that longer term issue underneath of overproduction. Although it does attract criticism because of course it seems counterintuitive to many people at this time that people are homeless and out of work and yet you're paying people to produce less and to even destroy food. So it did attract some criticism. However, it's a very, very popular, very successful scheme. Over the next few years, tobacco, beef, dairy farmers were brought into the scheme and farm incomes increased significantly in this period. Between 1932 and 1935, farm income rose from $4.5 billion to $6.9 billion, and it was very popular with farmers. 95%, as it says there, of tobacco farmers signing up for AAA agreements, showing how widespread the popularity of this was. FERRET is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Again, I always focus on that emergency relief part when I'm trying to remember this, because this is exactly what it does. It gives $500 million to be divided equally among the states to help with the unemployed. Obviously, the cost of trying to support all these people who are out of work at this time had grown massively. So this was meant to be national funding that would help states with their issues. Half of the money went straight to the states, and the other half was conditional on the states spending money on relief. Some states were reluctant to do so. The money tended to be spent on things like soup kitchens to provide food for the hungry, blankets, employment schemes, even nursery schools, so that there was some childcare provided so that people could then go out to work. The scheme wasn't totally successful because it really depended on where you live. Many state governments thought that poor people were really in that position through their own fault, that they'd only become lazy if the state helped them too much. And this meant that it wasn't always easy to claim this relief. They made it very difficult, queuing in kind of long queues in hot weather, delays in making payments, trying to put people off. But certainly it has a significance, and it established the idea of the national government, giving funds for relief. CWA is a very short-lived agency, the Civil Works Administration, but I wouldn't judge it too harshly for that. It was established to provide emergency relief during the winter of 1933 to 34, and it provided work for people on public works projects for the winter before being closed down. Now, it was only ever intended to be a short-term agency, so as I say, I wouldn't judge it too harshly because of the fact that it closes down. It was always intended that this is what would happen. And you can see the success of this with the way that FERA now said that they would agree to follow this up with more public-funded works projects. The CCC I always find amongst my students is one of the more memorable ones. So this is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is the one where unemployed young men aged between 17 and 24, it was later increased to 28, were recruited by the Department of Labour to work in national forests, national parks, to do all sorts of work there. About 3 million young people were involved, and they could join the scheme for periods of 6 months. And if you didn't have work at the end of the 6 months, you could join up for a further 6 months. And the majority of the money earned was sent back to the men's families. These people are doing all sorts of work, planting trees, dealing with all sorts of aspects of work in the countryside, dealing with forest fires, installing telephone lines through rural areas. And the young men who were involved benefit from the experience and training provided. I always think that the young men who were involved in this scheme, they were probably in one of the most difficult positions in the Depression to a certain extent. Because if you were an older person in work, there's a chance you might hold on to your job, and at least you've got some sort of training and references. For young people trying to enter the job market during the time of the Depression, it's very, very difficult for them to get started. So this is at least, as I say, providing some sort of training, experience, references for these men. However, the CCC does face criticism as it mostly focuses on white men. And of course, there was no guarantee of a job afterwards once you finish these 6-month placements. The NRA you associate with this blue eagle that you can see on the side of the screen here. This was an organisation trying to improve working conditions. And each industry was encouraged to adopt a code of practice that was fair to workers. If your company adopted this code of practice, they could display a blue eagle on their products. And there were big kind of government campaigns encouraging people to buy from these blue eagle firms. This organisation, however, is the one that the Supreme Court declares unlawful, unconstitutional. They say that this is an overreach in the power of the national government. This isn't lawful, their attempt to try and control these things. And therefore, this one is later closed down, this organisation. The PWA is one of our big organisations, the Public Works Administration. The PWA is funded with $3.3 billion, and the idea is pump priming. Now you can see the cartoon on the right-hand side. Well, it's a critical cartoon, but you can kind of see what Roosevelt's trying to do here. He's trying to pump this water pump, trying to get things moving again. This is a very critical cartoon showing that they're spending money and not much is coming out of it. But certainly, the original idea is that this would stimulate the economy and get it moving again. So it was funded with $3.3 billion, and it was spent on big public works projects like building roads, dams, hospitals, schools, all in the hope that this would stimulate the economy. And the vision is wider than just employing a few people on these projects. If you imagine, for instance, if there was a new school building built in stone, yes, there would be the people employed on the actual site doing the work, but it would lead to demand for materials as well. You'd need glass for the windows, you need the bricks, you need all sorts of things. That would need to knock-on effect to other local businesses. If you imagine if those people working on the site now have a bit of money in their pocket to spend, perhaps they walk home and spend their money in a few shops on the way or buy lunch somewhere as they go. So the vision is wider than this. It's not just about providing work for that narrow group of people who are working on these projects, although this certainly employs a lot of people at the time. The idea is that this will more widely get the economy shifting again because it will give these people money to spend and a knock-on effect to other industries. Eventually, the PWO is responsible for building 50,000 miles of roads and 13,000 schools. In the West, dams were built, which helped to irrigate land that had been semi-desert, produce electricity. They create 4 large national parks, and hundreds of thousands of people gained jobs through these projects. TV TVA is the Tennessee Valley Authority, and this was meant to help an area which had great kind of environmental and physical geographical problems. So in the wet season, this area would flood very badly. In the dry, it would become almost like a dust bowl because it would be too dry. And many people living in this area were in massive poverty, including not even having electricity. The problems of the Tennessee Valley were too large for one state to cope with because this area cut across 7 states. So the national government took a role in trying to invest in this area. And the plan that they come up with is that they're going to build dams. They build 20 dams. Now, this is a very clever scheme because, first of all, yes, it's going to provide people with work. But again, it's wider than that. It's hopefully going to address some of those geographical issues, controlling the floods, and in the drier season, providing irrigation to farmland as well. The dams were also used for hydroelectric power, providing electricity to the area. And building the dams, as we've just said, also provides thousands of jobs. HULC was the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This was meant to help many people who are struggling to pay their mortgages at this time. Obviously, this happens because people lose their jobs, or even if you retain your job, your working hours might be cut. More and more people are in danger of defaulting on their mortgages. HULC essentially bought the mortgages from the banks, and then you would make, as the mortgage payer, your payments back to HULC instead. And often this would offer things like lower interest rates, so your payments would be a bit lower. It made mortgages more affordable for people and made it more likely that they can keep up with their mortgages. Again, a very successful scheme. 300,000 loans given out in the first year. And between 1933 and 36, they estimate that HULC rescued about 20% of American homeowners, and over 80% of these successfully repaid their HULC mortgages. After all of these, the Second New Deal is introduced. This is introduced in 1935 because they fear that America, despite all this spending, is not recovering quite as quickly as Europe. So Roosevelt, surrounded by some of his advisors, some members of the Senate who really believe in his vision, encourage him to now go even further. The Works Progress Administration is very similar to the PWA that we've just been discussing. Again, it became a major employer with around 2 million employees at any time. And again, they're building big projects like airport landing fields, playgrounds, schools. There was a rule that they weren't allowed to compete for contracts with private firms because, of course, you didn't want to run existing building companies, for instance, out of business. But again, the idea is it's going to stimulate the economy and provide work for people. The WPA also goes a bit further and creates jobs for office workers, actors, artists, photographers, all sorts of people getting work through the WPA. The Social Security Act in 1935 was the first federal national action providing old age pensions for over 65s and unemployment insurance. However, it had to be self-financing. It was paid for by employees and employers, and pensions weren't paid at a flat rate, but according to how much the worker had previously contributed. Unemployment benefits were low and were paid for only a limited period, a maximum of $18 a week for 16 weeks. The Act also allowed state governments to work with Washington to provide help for sick or disabled people, but certainly an initial attempt, at least, to try and provide unemployment insurance, old age pensions for people on a national scale. And while the support provided was limited, it was a big step towards providing welfare to those in need, but it did face huge criticism from Roosevelt's opponents who criticised the spending. The Wagner Act in 1935 forced employers to negotiate with trade unions regarding pay and conditions, and this act made it illegal to sack workers for being in a union. So I guess part of that further reform that's going on in this period, trying to improve working conditions for people. Now, there are various success and criticisms of the New Deal. Obviously, these various agencies had done things like provided work, tried to ensure that people didn't default on their mortgages. But there are still big problems facing the American economy by the time the Second World War breaks out. And by 1941, the year that America joins the war, the New Deal was being highly criticised in some quarters for being expensive, for expanding the involvement of the government in people's lives in individual states. Unemployment was still 6 million in 1941. It had been 12 million under Hoover. So it's half, but it's still very high. And confidence ultimately was still quite low, and therefore spending was still low. In other words, even those people that had now found work, they weren't too keen on spending their money in case things took a downturn again. The thing that's going to bring America fully out of the Depression is the impact of the Second World War. So from 1939, even though America hasn't joined the war yet, defence spending begins to increase, and they sell goods to Britain and her allies. From 1941, Lend-Lease is approved, and this is a big stimulus to the American economy. This was an agreement that they will provide Britain, for instance, with goods to fight the war, and this would be paid for at the end of the war. So even though they're not getting any money for it yet, the fact that all of these goods are beginning to be produced in American factories paid for by the American government for the moment puts lots and lots of people into work and really begins to move unemployment levels downwards. In December 1941, America themselves joined the war, and now unemployment falls to around zero because of the production of war materials, and 12 million also joined the armed forces as well. 500,000 new businesses set up at this time, and some industries expand enormously. A good example of this is Wrigley's, who we know for making the chewing gum nowadays. Back then, they are a chewing gum manufacturer, but they get the big contract to pack all the rations for the American soldiers going to Europe. So their business, for example, expands enormously at this time. There were social developments during the war as well. We've previously looked about African Americans and women in our period of the 1920s, and we've mentioned some of the things that happened to these groups in the 1930s as well. During the war, African Americans, some of them became involved in the fighting against Nazi Germany. Now, the fact that the war was against Nazi Germany, and of course in the propaganda people emphasised the kind of racist nature of the Nazi state, well, it started to raise some difficult questions really about treatment of African Americans at home in America as well. 1 million African American soldiers fight in the Second World War, and when they're deployed to Europe, we don't want to make Europe sound as though it was a totally kind of non-racist utopia, but for some of these soldiers, it was the first time that they had experienced a non-segregated society, and being able to visit, for instance, in Britain, pubs along with white people without kind of experiencing that segregation. 2 million African Americans become involved in war work as well, producing war materials. Many people move up to the north at this time for the work that's available there, and where some of the racism is less severe than it is in the southern states of America. And certainly after the war, there's hopeful that there will be some meaningful change for the lives of African Americans. This is why groups like the NAACP increase their membership at this time. For women, well, women take, as they had in the First World War, a role in war production again, helping to build materials for the war. In the munitions industry, for example, 1 in every 2 workers is women, and the percentage of married women working increases at this time from 35 to 50%. Again, for some women, it led to hope that they could perhaps lead a bit of a different life after the war, although some of these women were happy enough to return to the home when the men returned home at the end of the Second World War. And there was certainly an expectation from the vast majority of people, from employers, from men returning from war, that women would return to the home after the war and allow them to take the jobs back up again. So that's the end of this section on the second part of the USA specification. As I keep saying at the end of these videos, to support your revision, I would rewatch this video as many times as you need to, pausing it wherever you need to. Read your revision guide, complete any associated activities, use your printed notes. There's full and simplified versions that you should hopefully have already. They're also available on the shared area, or you could email your class teacher if you're really stuck. Make your own revision notes like index cards, but then use those to do something like test yourself. And look at past paper questions again as well. You could have a go at past papers, or even if you just bullet point mind map answers, that would be really helpful. So thank you very much for watching. Remember, there is a part 3 to the USA video revisions. This is video 2 of 3. Yeah, thank you very much and good luck for your exams.